All right, well, I guess we'll go ahead and get started, and welcome to the world of modern technology, right? I'm sorry I can't see all of you, and but anyway, we can forge ahead, and it's sort of an apropos snafu, given that our topic is disappointment. And so I was noticing my own disappointment at not being able to get on, and sort of worried about what was going to happen and how many people were there, and if we canceled it, would they come back? And I just noticed this whole story starting to unfold as a result of my disappointment. And disappointment comes in many forms. The meditation today is specifically about disappointment when it comes to our expectations in relationships. And so I want to make a clear distinction that disappointment is not wrong or bad. It's a natural human reaction, but it does tie to how big of a story we make about how bad the situation is. So, for example, in this moment, I could devolve into a big story of operatic proportions about how horrible it is that the webinar is not working the way I want it to. Or I can register my disappointment and then deal with my own internal anxiety, and then notice what happens when I'm just flexible and go with what I've got. And when I go with what I've got, I trust that it's all going to work out, and you know, everybody's going to get what they need here, all of you and all of me, and life will go on, obviously. So if we would click to the next slide, that says disappointment at the top, and we have today's quote. That's what disappointment is, a sense of loss for something you never had. And I think that's a pretty profound statement, because I'm going to keep referring back to this incident today and saying that I could be disappointed about something that never happened to begin with. And if I can stay present with what is, then I can have the experience of having the opportunity to interact with all of you today, sort of the magic of being able to do so with people all over the country, if not all over the world, and to be grateful for what is. So to not be disappointed for something I never even had to begin with is the challenge, and that's the challenge of flexibility and also the challenge in relationship. Next slide, please. The first point on this slide is being in relationship with other human beings brings guarantees that we will be regularly disappointed due to human fallibility. And that's probably the number one primary rule to be in relationship with another person. And that is that if you're a human being and you're in relationship with another human being, you are going to be disappointed. And to act like we're not going to be disappointed is our own fantasy or fallibility, that we let each other down every day of the week, we forget things, we interrupt each other, we do stupid things unintentionally, and we routinely disappoint those who are closest to us. But I believe that being in relationship with another human, we just have to understand that disappointment is part and parcel of that endeavor. And if we were disappointed routinely as children in our families of origin, then that's going to be a real sore spot, and one that we have to attend to in our own work and on our journeys in life, to recognize that when we are disappointed, it's not necessarily personal or that somebody's doing something to us. It's just life, and it's just how things happen. How often have you fixated on an ideal way you wanted your partner to behave or look, and were so disappointed when they showed up instead as themselves? And, you know, I grapple with this all the time, that I think when we fall in love, we have this ideal way we want our partner to behave and how they want to look, and we're all on our best behavior. And Helen Fisher, in her book, Why We Love, talks about what happens in these early stages of falling in love. And when the sheen of those early neurochemicals and sort of nature's glue for putting us together starts to wear off, what happens is we start to see our partners as who they really are, as opposed to our fantasy of who we wanted them to be. So they're not perfect. They might not be as attractive as we once thought they were. We don't like their hair or the way they walk. All this sort of nitpicking starts to come into the picture because we were perhaps more in love with our fantasy or our ideal than the human being in front of us. And so to allow our partners to be imperfect, to allow ourselves to be disappointed, means that we have to lower our expectations just lower our expectations so we're in reality, which brings us to the next point, which is that expectation is the springboard for disappointment and displeasure, especially when our desire to control what we aspire to gets wrested out of our sticky fingers by life and frustrates our dreams. So if we take some time with that and recognize that if you, a good example always is planning a trip, and there's an old adage that half the fun of the trip is in the planning of it, because we're preparing for and we have this expectation of what it's going to look like. It's going to look like the pictures in the travel brochures, and the people are going to look that way, and it's all going to have this kind of magical Caribbean cruise sort of feel to it. And then, we get on a plane and there are long lines and we're hassling getting through security, and the seats are tight on the plane, and then we get there and we're exhausted because we have jet lag, and maybe the beaches aren't as perfect as they were in the picture, and you're sort of sick because you ate something bad and you get lost, and on it goes, where the reality gets wrested out of our fingers by life, and it frustrates this fantasy or dream that we had. And the only antidote to that is to get really, really present with what is, to be in gratitude for the fact that you can even afford a plane ticket. And of course, I'm using this plane ticket and travel fantasy as a metaphor for anything, whether it's being with a friend or a lover or going out to a certain kind of meal. That any place we put heavy expectations, we will be disappointed. And
Alex,
yes,
we have a comment from Mississippi that expectations are premeditated resentments.
Oh, that's a great statement also.
Yeah, and we have a question from Pennsylvania. If disappointment is only for something I never had, what is it when my expectations are not met based on something I have had?
Well, I think when we have an expectation based on something we have had, then we're comparing the present to the past. So, again, if we use travel, it's a pretty benign metaphor. If I have been to San Francisco before and I'm going again and I expect it to be like the last time I was there, and I get there, instead of it being kind of cool and crisp and a little sunny, it's instead foggy and freezing, and I hate my hotel and all my expectations are or my fantasies out the window, then I expected it to look like it did the last time I was there. And that's on me. That's not San Francisco's fault. San Francisco is mutable and changing and diverse, every minute of every day, as is every other human being. So when we have had past relationships that went well, or our partner used to be X, Y, or Z, and now they're ABC, then we are pinning ourselves, or we're setting ourselves up for disappointment based on that expectation.
We have another comment from Florida that unfulfilled expectations are the predicator of resentments.
Right.
And we have a question from Oregon. How do you avoid having expectations?
Well, I don't know that we can avoid them. I think this speaks to the absolute paradox in life, where we have to hold both polarities at all times. So it's okay to have the anticipation, perhaps, of an evening, that it's going to be really fun, and I'm excited to meet my friends, and I'm excited about this new club or restaurant or what have you. At the same time, recognizing that I just need to be present with the evening and see how it unfolds without labeling it or ladening it with expectation. So anticipation of excitement, fun, pleasure, joy is fine. And we have to be in reality that none of that might happen, and not put too much expectation and weight and pressure on the evening, on our lovers, on our friends.
We have a question from Vancouver. Aren't there healthy expectations, reasonable ones in relationships?
I think there are, and I think those have to be negotiated in the relationship. So if my expectation is that my partner is going to continue to have the job that he has, let's say we, met and he was gainfully employed and we moved in together and we decided that we were both going to contribute to our expenses and household and save money together. We were going to commingle our funds, for example. Then my expectation is that based on our agreement, he's going to continue to do that. And if he quits his job and gets one that pays comparably, then that's fine and that's his business. If he gets one where it's going to be a significant cut in his pay, and we're both in agreement that he's going to do that so he can also go to school, then that's another story. But if somebody de facto makes a move and changes what the agreed upon expectation is, then there is going to be a problem. So that's a different type of expectation, I think. It has to do with agreements.
And I'm hearing some squeaking, so if you've got your phone unmuted, if you could be conscious of any noises you're making, and Alex, I would be conscious of the microphone. Thanks.
Okay. All right, so any other thoughts on this topic? All right, the final point on, go ahead. Was there a question?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay, I thought I heard somebody. Do you allow for human error, or do you expect perfection, trying to control others and outcomes? And that's really the underlying crux to expectation, is if we have a fantasy about perfection, if we try to manipulate or control others so that we can have things look the way we want them to, then we're setting ourselves up and our relationships up for tremendous frustration and disappointment. All right, next slide, please, on perfectionism. So perfection can be an ism if we are constantly chasing it and constantly wanting others to be the way we need them to be. Perfection in and of itself is a form of beauty when we look at perfection in nature, for example, that even if you look at a rose, for as beautiful and magnificent as it might be, it may not be complete in some way, and even in the incompleteness is perfectionism. Maybe there's a little bit of a ding on a petal, or a bug has chewed a little piece of it off, but in its imperfection there is a beauty and a perfection. Constantly pursuing perfection steals the gift of what's in front of us right now and on the altar of our life. So again, if you walk through your garden, for example, you'll see the perfection of nature and beauty, and then you'll also see the perfection of bugs eating the leaves, and that creates a different sort of look to the garden. So really being in deep gratitude for what's in front of us is a way to ameliorate the pain of expectation and disappointment.
Alex, I have a question.
Yes.
From Mississippi. Do we allow for error, or how much error do we allow for?
Well, I think we have to allow for error, because otherwise we're in the realm of perfectionism. And this is about personal integrity and agreements, I think. So if you make an agreement with your partner and they uphold that agreement, then there's probably not going to be a lot of error. If somebody does make a mistake and they own it and say, gosh, I said I was going to do this and I didn't do it, or I can't do this over time, I thought I was going to be able to, but I can't uphold that for you, and what's that going to be like for you? Then you're in a dialogue, again, of openness and negotiation and problem solving, as opposed to not upholding your agreement and then being angry at your partner because they're upset or angry that you're not doing it. So we have to use our good judgment and our good sense and be in conversation with one another when these things shift and change. So any other questions?
Nope.
Okay. This next point about clinging to your reigning fantasy blinds you to the infinite richness and texture of real human beings and leaves you an emotional pauper. So when you hold to the way you think it should be, if you're living in fantasy and really sort of a fantasy addict, then you will never ever have the experience of the perfectly imperfect state of humanity, and that will leave you isolated and alone and lonely. And that again is about the absolutely sort of crazy texture of what it means to be an imperfect human being. And a life lived in fantasy or in the throes of love addiction is tragic because it keeps us from ever having our feet on the ground solidly enough to be embodied and present. And many people who are avoidant of love and relationships end up in the throes of love addiction because it's hard to tolerate another person's humanity, especially if you didn't get that sort of tolerance as a child. So our culture also tends to kind of wrap us in this fantasy also about how we're supposed to look and behave and how lovely relationships turn out on TV or in movies, as opposed to the real grit and grind of living through a relationship and making it work and forgiving our partners and ourselves. And standing in reality with the willingness to accept the bounty that comes your way is the only antidote to disappointment. So again, all of these points on this slide point to being present, being in reality for what is, being grateful for what is, and not becoming enslaved to or disappointed by some expectation about something that maybe you're never going to have. And that goes back to someone else's point. If you're routinely disappointed in your life, then maybe you're in the wrong life. Maybe you're with the wrong partner because you're expecting, let's say if you live in Seattle and you're constantly angry and disappointed because it's cold or raining, then maybe you should be living in Florida. Maybe you're just in the wrong place. And if you have a partner who can't provide for you emotionally, physically, financially the way you want to be provided for, then rather than bludgeoning your partner and being routinely disappointed and miserable, you need to find somebody who can do those things for you.
Okay, we have a few questions.
Okay.
From Pasadena. So what if someone shows up in relationship as being a certain way, and I liked those ways, and I come to expect they will continue acting or being in those ways? Is it wrong to expect them to continue acting in those ways when they completely change and start acting in other ways? How do you handle this sort of situation?
Well, I don't think it's wrong at all. I think it's about sitting down with your partner and saying, hey, when we met, you used to do all these things for me, for the relationship, for yourself, and now I've noticed that you're not doing any of those things anymore. What happened? And start a dialogue and stay in a place of curiosity and questioning. Maybe your partner is, tired or sick or beleaguered or feels like they're in the wrong relationship and they're just not saying. But it's really about query and asking and being genuinely curious and waiting to hear the answer, at which point you can say, I don't want to be in a relationship with somebody who doesn't listen to me emotionally. And you were really great at that the first 6 months of our relationship, but here we are a year and a half later, and whenever I want to talk to you, you're not interested in talking to me. I feel like whenever I have any problems, I have to go someplace else because you're not available. And so this is not a relationship that's nurturing to my mind, body, soul, so I can't be in it any longer. No offense. It's just, this is how it is. This is how you were. This is my perception of who you are now. Tell me what's changed, and then I can tell you whether I can continue to live with this or not.
And she says, thanks. We have a question from Vancouver. Is there a place for imagination in attracting what you desire? Do we not create some of our own reality, or is it all being done to us?
Well, I think when we talk about visioning, I think we do create our own reality. And there are many, many spiritual texts and teaching that point to this, that if you can conceive of something, if you can see it, if you can hold a vision for something, then you can conceive it or you can achieve it. So it has to be within the realm of possibility for you. So for example, if somebody came to me today and said, Alex, we think you should be a brain surgeon, and that you should, stop what you're doing and go to school and start becoming a brain surgeon, I'd have a really hard time holding a vision for that. It seems like it would be way out of my reach for a number of reasons. If instead someone said to me, well, I think you should take a cake baking class and learn to bake a cake, I could imagine doing that. I'm pretty sure that I could make time over a weekend. I could go take the class. I might fumble around a little bit, but I think if I imagined myself with a final cake baked, I could get that done. So what is your vision for your life, and the vision for the kind of person you want to be with, and how do you construct yourself so that you can attract that kind of person? So if you are, actively drinking and you're an active alcoholic and you want to attract somebody who is dignified and solid and stable in their life and comes from a good family, you're probably not going to get that. You're going to have to clean up your alcoholism first and deal with your issues first before you can attract the person that you say you want. So I think that we do construct our life the way we want it. We can achieve what we have a vision for, but we have to do our own work for it also. And that's different than just being in fantasy and hoping and waiting that your prince or princess are going to show up.
And the person who asked the question from Vancouver says, I love your answer. Holding a vision, it's proactive and speaks to our bigness of being a divine being. Thank you.
I would agree with that. So I think we have to hold a vision and also move our feet. We have to do the work.
And we have a question, what, if any, differences are there between fantasizing and identifying true wants and needs, as well as visualizing goals?
I think fantasy is a dissociative proposition, and it can have us, especially if people have been fantasizing from the time they were children, they literally create neuronal pathways in the brain that's somewhat dissociative, and it can be very isolating to live in fantasy because there's a grandiose aspect to it of, I'm going to marry somebody and I'm going to have this really beautiful life and I'm going to have this and that, and I just ruminate or stay in my fantasy for days and weeks and months and years on end, but I don't ever do anything about it. Fantasy can be a momentary bubble and burst also. And a lot of creativity comes from fantasy or daydreaming even. And we don't do enough daydreaming, and we certainly don't allow our children enough time to daydream because it's a very creative place. So dissociation can be pathological or problematic. It can also be average, like when you're driving home from work and you get home and you have no idea how you got there. That's a dissociative space where you're just driving by rote. And then there is the dissociation that comes with people who are mathematicians or musicians or artists, where they're in kind of another zone or flow state. So all of those things are the brain's way of fluxing in and out of just thinking all the time. And Tom, what were the other 2 points? There was fantasy and what else?
And identifying true wants and needs, as well as visualizing goals.
Okay, so identifying true wants and needs can really be challenging, especially if somebody's lived in fantasy for a long time. So I would encourage you to do some journaling about that, a lot of journaling. In Julia Cameron's book, The Artist's Way, it's an old book where she talks about writing morning pages every day, and writing 3 pages every morning without fail, and letting yourself just write automatically and seeing what starts to emerge about what you want, who you are, and asking yourself questions about what has meaning to me, what do I value, what kind of place do I want to live in, what is the feeling tone of that place? What do I want to do? Am I somebody who likes working in a solitary way, or am I very gregarious and need people, etc.? And all of those questions can be asked by way of creating a vision board. When we talk about visioning, we're talking about the mind, or Aristotle said the soul thinks in pictures. So get a bunch of magazines, get some poster board, and start cutting things out and pasting them on a board to start to look at or create a vision for what you would actually like to have in your life. And that starts to make a vision concrete, and it starts to not have you living in some fantasy or expectation that you're magically going to be saved or magically going to have a career. It actually gives you a vision of what you want, and then you have to ask yourself what the actionable steps are to take to start to get those things. So let's say you want a big fancy house, and you want a fancy house in the city or in the country, either way. You've got to track back and ask yourself, well, how am I going to get that? Am I going to marry somebody who's wealthy, or am I going to make my own money? And if I'm going to make my own money, what do I have to do to make my own money? Well, maybe I need to change jobs, or maybe I need to go back to school and get a higher education, in which case I'm going to either start job hunting, or I'm going to start looking at schools and enroll in school, and I'm going to take active action to start to move myself towards having that house in the country or in the city. And that makes us, that puts us squarely into reality, and it activates us in our own lives as opposed to living in fantasy or expectation, which will only set us up for disappointment and feeling stuck and never really getting anywhere.
Okay, Alex, we have one more question.
Okay.
From Pasadena. How do you get over the disappointment in a failed marriage? I'm struggling with this right now. Hard for me to let go of resentments towards the ex-partner, and we have a child together, making things very difficult because I'm having a hard time getting over the disappointment from the marriage ending because I didn't want it to end.
Yeah, this is one of the profound pains in life, I think, and it takes a lot of intrapersonal work on our parts, that I think it's human nature to feel like we failed when our relationships failed, that we did something wrong. All of our shame comes to the surface about not being good enough or sexy enough or smart enough or you name it enough. And that sort of shame spiral can be incredibly debilitating. So working with those inner states is important, and letting yourself feel the depths of your grief and your despair for starters, because obsessive thoughts and thoughts about being wrong somehow are a way to stay out of feelings. So first I would say to dive deeply into the feelings and let yourself cry and grieve the loss of the relationship, because to try and leapfrog that will only create problems. And I know when you have a child, that's difficult because you don't want your child seeing you just distraught constantly because it distresses the child. So whether you do this when your child's not at home, or you go to your own therapy, or find a 12-step support group, but do something to really support the grief and loss that you're feeling. Then also start to journal about, what you see went wrong, maybe what your part was in it, what your partner's part was in it, so you can see it was a pretty level playing field. And also, I think you have to look for the silver lining in the cloud, because sometimes people come together to have a child, and without him and you, without the two of you coming together, you wouldn't have had the beautiful child that you have. And even though you didn't want it to end, you've got to let go so that you're not grasping at something that clearly was not meant to be for whatever reasons. So when you can unhook yourself from this and have freedom, then your life will start to soar and change and grow, and you will be a better parent all the way around. But this isn't a light switch, unfortunately. It's a process, and it can take, anywhere from 1 to 3 years to grieve the loss of anything. So be gentle with yourself, give yourself time, and, remind yourself that it wasn't your fault, that this is something that was largely out of your control, because if it had been in your control, you would have stopped it.
Alex, we have a follow-up question.
Okay.
How do I unhook myself from it? I'm having a hard time not being mean to him. I just want to hurt him when I see him and be unkind. It's hard to be nice because of the disappointment.
Right. So your anger and resentment and rage is a way of still holding on to the relationship. So you are making it loud and clear to him that you want him to suffer the way that you've suffered, and that, you're not done yet. And that's only ultimately going to be hurting you, because you're in some story of having been, that somebody did something to you, which can be a victim stance. And then if you're taking a stance of retribution and retaliation, you're really hurting yourself ultimately. So be very, very careful about that. I suggest that you do some writing before you see him, you get yourself centered, and you recognize that he is also an infallible human being who disappointed you, but you have to be able to drop it and move on. And again, it's going to take time, but I suggest you use some tools for sort of organizing yourself and regulating yourself before you see him, so that you're not bringing harm to your child also, because your child's going to feel this animosity, and it's going to be very dysregulating for the child.
She says thank you. And we have one more question, but why don't we go to the next slide, and then I'll forward it to you later.
Okay, so the next slide is about the myths of attainment. The first point says, no matter how hard we try, we're often captivated by that cultural setup for disappointment, the happily ever after story. And I think there's nothing more provocative than the happily ever after story. It may be the most sought after story on the planet. Sort of being captured by the white dress or the black suit, depending on your gender. And there is no fairy tale ending. Somebody's going to leave somebody. Somebody's going to die first. Somebody's going to get sick. Something is going to befall us in this lifetime. We do not live in, some sort of bubble. And I think part of the pains that we're going through as a culture is that our consumer culture constantly sells us mythology about beauty and happiness, and yet there's more pain on the planet right now than there has been in a very long time. We have horrible atrocities happening every day and in the news. People starving to death, people dying from illness, people being bombed in their homes and villages every day. And yet we get captivated by this fantasy that we're going to be happily ever after with one person, I think, as a way to not have to have our hearts break a million times a day for the abject pain that's in the world. So keep in mind that your partner cannot be all things to you. No one person can be all things to anybody unless you're an infant, in which case the mother is the infant's center of the universe. And that even starts to change at 3, 6, 9 months when the mother and the infant start to separate, and the mother all of a sudden is no longer just a source of regulation and complete joy and bliss to the infant, but she starts to become an object of a pro-social object that starts to say no and shame the child in an effort to keep the child safe. So even that most perfect blissed out relationship between mother and child changes in very short order. So be careful about happily ever after. If you are incredibly in love with somebody and you are happily choosing to marry them and your wedding day is the most happy and beautiful moment in your life, then grab it. Grab that day. Enjoy it. Because it will not last. It's a day. It's a moment in life. And I believe we get moments of joy, moments of wholeness, moments of happiness. But we don't escape this life without our suffering. And I think that all of our suffering is a part of our personal growth and development. It challenges us to use every emotional and psychological muscle we have to keep forging ahead and not end up bitter or angry. The next point says, from childhood, we're told that once we find our soulmates, we'll skip down the aisle of marital bliss onto easy street. We uphold this myth with fervor, even in the face of failure of half of all marriages. And that speaks to what I was saying before, that, marriage is work, love is work. Erich Fromm wrote about love, many years ago, I think 1956, when he talked about love being an art. And that love was, sort of something that somebody fell into if they were lucky. But that, over time, love is not something that just, happens. We have to work at love. I mean, he talked about love as an art form, just like painting or any other art form where the artist had to take steps in learning. So we have to master the practice of loving. And even after a great deal of practice, we still have to keep returning to the notes that make most sense for us and that keep us and our relationships going. It's not easy, and it's not a storybook situation. And holding the possibility that love can last forever while recognizing it, like everything else alive, will change over time, liberates us from expectation and disappointment. So I often hear people say, certainly men that I work with, that they're looking for a mate, and they're looking for a mate that's really beautiful, but many men will get involved with women that are considerably younger than them because they don't want to deal with the aging, changing process. They don't want to deal with their own aging, changing process, and they don't want it reflected back to them in a mate. And part of loving forever, or lasting, making that love last forever, means that we have to shift and change along with our changing bodies and faces and every other part of ourselves. So that, again, is another paradox that we have to hold, that we can love forever, and for today, we don't know what's going to happen, about anything, really, but certainly not whether or not our partners are going to stay in love with us, leave us, not leave us if we want them to leave us. We just don't know. So any other questions here, Tom?
Yeah, I have a question from Portland. What if you find yourself being too discerning when meeting men? In this state, you reject people because of the vision of what you are attracted to and need in a partner?
Well, then I think you have to look at whether you're talking about discernment or if you are talking about avoidance. Because you can have a whole list and idea of the kind of person you want to be with, but if you are expecting that they're going to show up exactly as you've got it written out on paper, then you're going to be disappointed and you'll be alone eventually, because nobody's perfect, and you have to ask yourself, what are your absolute non-negotiables? In fact, there's a great book that I love called If the Buddha Dated by Charlotte Castle, and she delineates 7 different sort of categories for or criteria for meeting a person that has to do with things like education and sense of humor, religion or spirituality, lifestyle choices, appearance. And she has you get really clear about which of those 7 criteria are important to you, and then she has you distill it down to the top 3. And so if when you're dating, somebody meets your top 3 criteria, then you're going to have to loosen up a little around the other 2 or 3. If there are things that are non-negotiable, for example, like religion, if you are Jewish, then you shouldn't, and your Judaism is important to you, then don't date anyone who's not Jewish, period. And that will start to narrow some of those factors down also. Likewise, if you like guys that are, tall and blonde, then don't date men that are shorter and dark-haired. So don't date that group of people. So that's a way to be discerning, but then you want to be careful that you're not too picky, because picking creates separation, and it may be worth looking to see if that lines up with your own avoidance. Any other questions about that topic?
There are. I see we have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to put the next slide up.
All right.
And here's a question from Los Angeles. When someone has an expectation from you and you fail to make them happy, what is it that one is supposed to do?
Well, I think you have to talk to the person about how you're not going to be able to measure up to what their expectation is. So you've got to, really ask yourself, can I meet what this person needs? And if I can't, then I need to be honest with myself and with them and say, I can't do that for you. If I can't get this right for you, then I'm not the right person for you, because I've tried, I've given it my best effort. I feel like sometimes you are raising the bar on me, and so I feel like this is set up that I can never quite get it right, and it's really distressing me also. I see that it upsets you, and it's upsetting to me because it's making me feel like there's something wrong with me, and I don't like that. So whatever it is, there has to be an explicit conversation about it. All right, so the next slide says changing the pattern of disappointment. When we accept that beautiful and extraordinary moments come when we least expect it and are most surprised by it, this allows life's true magic to happen. And I would say that that is probably one of the most liberating ways to live our lives, is to drop our expectation of what the day is going to be like when we walk out the door in the morning, and to be open to the possibilities before us, to be in gratitude for the sunshine and the breeze on our faces and the fact that we have a job, and even though the person that works with us is kind of kooky, at least they make us laugh, even though they can be annoying, what have you. But to really be present, to accept more, to be glad that reality rarely mirrors our fantasy or expectations, but it paradoxically allows great possibility and less disappointment every day. And then make a list of the 5 times you were disappointed. Is there a pattern wherein you set yourself up to have a bad experience? What part do you play in your disappointments? And I think that's what we've been pointing to today also. And the group affirmation is, may we experience a deeper level of acceptance, intimacy, and fulfillment in our relationships. And so I think if we can hold that thought, that by experiencing a deeper level of acceptance, our own willingness to be intimate and fulfilled in our relationships, then maybe our expectations will actually start to come true, because we're more present with the person opposite us, humanity, and less in our fantasy of how we would like them to be. So perhaps we can surprise ourselves today by walking through the world from this place of acceptance. So is there any one last question before we stop?
We have a few questions, let's see, but maybe the last one. And people can always call our intake line just to talk and ask questions. That number is 310-843-9902. We have a question, how does one deal with avoidance? How do you overcome avoidant behavior?
Are we talking about one's own avoidant behavior, I assume? Because we can't really control somebody else's avoidant behavior. But these avoidance structures are embedded deeply in our nervous systems, and they likely got set up when we were very, very small, infancy, toddlerhood, and that has to do with our primary caregiver. So in my experience, avoidance is something that is viscerally felt. You can actually feel an energy or a state in the body, in your chest, kind of down into your gut, where you feel yourself retreating or retracting. And when you have that feeling, the challenge is to do that which is counterintuitive, which is to move towards your partner. If you feel yourself, it's a form of disconnect, it's a mild form of dissociation. When you can say to your partner in that moment where you feel yourself retreating, or ask them to give you a hug, rather, that will help regulate your nervous system so that you're more present and more in the moment. That is one way. The other way is if somebody gives you a compliment, for example, and you notice yourself avoiding that, to make eye contact with a person and say thank you, and notice what it feels like to tolerate being receptive in that way. So receiving from other people, asking for help, those are ways to start to change some of these avoidance structures internally. All right, anything else?
Yeah, maybe one last question from Charleston, South Carolina.
Okay.
How do you deal with disappointment with someone with a personality disorder such as borderline PD? How do you make boundaries of what's acceptable and what's not?
Well, I think you have to set boundaries with a person like that because they're unpredictable. If they are getting help, they're in therapy, and you're very close to them, again, it depends on the relationship, but if you're very close to them, they're in therapy, I would ask to go to therapy with them and talk to them about it in the therapy so that you feel like it's a safe place to have a conversation. If it's somebody who's an acquaintance, then you need to set better boundaries for yourself. If somebody can only deliver so much and they repeatedly disappoint you, then it's your fault, not theirs. So, for example, if I have a friend who is an acquaintance or somebody I know that's not reliable, and I ask them to house sit my house for a week because I'm going to be gone, water my plants and take care of my pets. And I give them the keys to my house and I come home and, my house is a mess and my plants are dried out. Whose fault is that? It's not that person's fault, it's my fault because I trusted them again to do something they weren't really capable of doing. So we have to look at why we stay in relationship with people, what value we get from it, and whether we're giving them too much responsibility by not setting good enough boundaries or not. So sometimes we can have people really close to us, and sometimes they have to be at arm's length as a way to protect ourselves from unnecessary upset and damage. All right. Anything else?
Gosh, let me run through this. I've been typing.
Okay.
I am dealing with a business partner who is also my roommate. I feel invalidated as a person in my own home. I feel she's trying to make me be her. Like her expectations are the only ones that matter.
Well, that sounds to me like a very bad situation because to be in business with somebody and be roommates with them is a lot of forced intimacy. And it sounds like you need to have some difficult conversations with this person where you sit down and say, look, there's our personal relationship and our business relationship. And the experience I'm having is that I feel devalued and I feel discounted by you. And that you think that, or it feels like you think that your opinion is the only one that matters here, not mine. So we're going to have to do something differently. And maybe what it means is you're going to have to move out so that you're not living together. And I realize that's not something you can do tomorrow, that takes some time, but you may have to set the intention yourself for starting to look for another roommate or moving out yourself or finding your own place so that you can create some space and keep it business and not business and personal. But that sounds like you've got some boundaries that need to be cleared up there.
Great, and we have a lot of thank yous from people who are attending.
Oh, good. Well,
and I'll show them to you later.
Okay. Well, thank you all. I appreciate your patience with me just being a voice somewhere in cyberspace. And we will definitely alter this problem before next month. So I look forward to seeing you and talking to you in November. Thank you.